Hello, I'm Martin Lewis, Senior Lecturer Emeritus in the Department of History at Stanford University, and this is a lecture on the historical geography of tobacco. Part one of that lecture, I should say. Both of these lectures are part of a geocurrent series on the historical geography of natural mind-altering substances. Just a few highlights about tobacco to start out. As we will see, tobacco was extremely important almost everywhere in North and South America, except the Arctic region before the year 1500, was unknown in the Old World, except for a little bit of a very similar nicotine-containing plants found in the outback of Australia. Tobacco globalized explosively in the 16th and 17th centuries. We see the development of distinctive tobacco cultures. We move on then to the increased health problems that emerge after cigarettes were developed in the 1850s. And then we see a rapid decline in use after 1960, but with a lot of geographical variation. So as I'm sure everybody knows, smoking tobacco, and tobacco in general, especially smoking cigarettes, is quite harmful. So that isn't news, and I won't dwell on it. As is also well known, tobacco is very addictive. Some studies suggest that it's equal to or even more addicting than drugs like cocaine or heroin, although there's a lot of debate about that. But just to go back and focus on the origin of tobacco, area of domestication is uncertain. There's some debate on this, but almost certainly from South America, perhaps in the region of the central Andes and adjoining lowlands. The map also shows the extent of use around the year 1500. I put a question mark in the far north because it's difficult to say how far north tobacco was used, but it was pretty ubiquitous through most of the two American continents. In fact, tobacco was even cultivated by some hunter-gatherer groups, people who were non-agricultural, did not grow crops, but tobacco was such importance that a number of them seem to have grown some tobacco. The map shows the spread of tobacco, showing three different species. Nicotiana tabacum coming in from South America into North America with a black arrow is the dominant form, well, pretty much the only form today. There's a little bit of Tabacum rustica, a much more potent variety grown in a few indigenous communities in the Americas. But this map derived from the scientific article that is shown here in the slide pretty accurately, at least from as far as what we know, accurately depicts the spread of tobacco use and tobacco cultivation. And as the other bit of text from Science News shows, evidence now suggests that tobacco has been used for over 12,000 years, which is a tremendously long period of time, although there's a lot of uncertainty about that. In pre-Columbian North and South America, tobacco was used in a variety of ways. It was sniffed, ground up and sniffed. It was chewed. It was actually eaten, which can be pretty dangerous because it's toxic when eaten. It was used in ointments and eye drops, even in enemas. I put that in italics because I have a slide on it. And most commonly, it was smoked. And I should say, when Europeans came to the Americas and saw indigenous people smoking, they were shocked because there was no history of smoking anything in Europe up to that time. Some scholars say there was no smoking anywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere, although others think that cannabis was smoked in parts of Africa. But smoking was new and rather shocking and frightening. So the tobacco enemas were adopted in Europe. I find these illustrations quite amusing. Smoke or tobacco in an infusion in liquid would be entered into the body for gut pain, for hernias, even to resuscitate victims of near drowning, which seems surprising, and I don't know how efficacious it was in that regard. Also note that tobacco has been used extensively as an insecticide and is still used today. We can see some ads here for natural tobacco juice as a bug repellent. It was widely used, and like I say, sometimes still is, to infuse seed corn to kill any insects in it or to kill lice. Nicotine is an effective insecticide. It was also used for pain relief. It does have some analgesic properties. There's been quite a bit of scientific research on this. So I put in information from a scientific meta-analysis. The authors claim that nicotine produced acute analgesic effects, but they may be characterized as small or medium in magnitude. An acute nicotine-induced analgesia could make smoking more rewarding and harder to give up. In other words, it reduces pain, so people who suffer a lot of chronic pain and smoke cigarettes may find it harder to give up cigarettes or take tobacco in other forms because they lose that pain relieving or analgesic quality. In the Americas, in the pre-Columbian period, tobacco was used widely across societies, most of them, but it was used with special intensity in many societies by shamans or shamans, ritual specialists, who used it to enter really new states of consciousness or altered states of consciousness, which may seem quite surprising. I certainly found it surprising when I first read about it because nicotine is a harmful drug, but it's fairly mild in its effects. It is usually thought of as a stimulant that focuses concentration, not as something that is going to be responsible for a truly altered state of consciousness. But I mention a few things in the text here. One is what is known as the biphasic nature, which is if you take large doses of many substances, you get different effects. And very high doses of nicotine are going to have a much stronger mental as well as physical effect. Because of its toxicity, it can be dangerous to do this. And the last bit of text here mentions the possibility of shamans intentionally having near-death experiences from high levels of tobacco consumption. This is all quite uncertain, and there's a lot of speculation. Another issue is that in some tobacco species, especially the very powerful Nicotiana rustica, sometimes called Aztec tobacco, which was the prominent form of tobacco. It's a separate species, but it was the prominent form found in much of the eastern part of the United States. It not only has a lot more nicotine than regular tobacco, but it also has other alkaloids, harmaline, for example, which is associated with altered states of consciousness. Indigenous healers in places like the Amazon still use tobacco extensively. I cite here an article from 2020 and the title from the journal Ethnopharmacology, and the title really says it all. Tobacco is the chief medicinal plant in my work. Therapeutic uses of tobacco in Peruvian, Amazonian medicine exemplified by the work of a tabaquero, a master a tobacconist, if you will. And the article mentions that it's used by these traditional healers to treat mental and spiritual disorders, but also used for respiratory problems, which seems quite ironic considering the damage that tobacco smoking, cigarette smoking in particular, can do to the respiratory system. Used for parasites, which certainly makes some sense because it does kill insects and presumably parasites as well. Used for gout, I wonder about that. The article also mentions its psychoactive effects, much stronger than we would associate with mere tobacco use today. So again, using large quantities and potent varieties. And the article also mentions that this is a dangerous, these are dangerous procedures, and skilled practitioners are necessary, somebody who really understands tobacco and its dangers. In indigenous communities in North America now, there is a drive to return to sacred tobacco, if you will, and reduce cigarette smoking and other forms of commercial tobacco. So there's a national native network with the slogan, "Keep it sacred," and pushing to, as they say, improve our community through this sort of return. And to just read the quote here, traditional tobacco is a medicine which can be used in prescribed ways to promote physical, spiritual, emotional, and community well-being. It may be used as an offering to the creator or to another person, place, or being. In many teachings, the smoke from burned tobacco has a purpose of carrying our thoughts and prayers to the spirit world or to the creator. When used appropriately, traditional tobacco is not associated with addiction and adverse health effects. It may be controversial, but I find it quite interesting. It wasn't just tobacco that was important in indigenous communities in the Americas, but even the paraphernalia associated with it, especially in North America. Pipes. You've probably heard of peace pipes. There were also war pipes. Smoking with pipes was essential for many rituals and political processes where important decisions had to be reached. Elders and leaders of a community would gather together. Pipes would be brought out, tobacco would be smoked, and the political process then was sanctified and was allowed to play itself out. And it was, in many societies, sort of unthinkable to do these sort of important deliberative processes without the use of tobacco. And not just pipes, but the pipe stone was important because most stone is not appropriate for pipes. You need particular kinds. There's particularly one particular form of rock, Catlinite. It's a metamorphosed mudstone. It's fine-grained. It's easily worked. But we have here in southwestern Minnesota a pipestone national monument on the U.S. Historic Register of Places. This particular quarry was significant for some 23 tribal nations or groups. It was neutral territory where peoples from all groups could come and extract stone for pipe because it was so important across these different ethnic groups or tribal formations. Catlinite, that term may ring a bell. It's named from George Catlin, a famous artist of European background, but who was gained fame for painting mostly portraits of indigenous people. His most famous painting, though, is probably Comanche feats of horsemanship, which you can see on the bottom right, with a warrior basically leaning over the side of the horse, so he was shielded by his horse from enemy arrows or lances. When the Spaniards first got to the Americas and encountered tobacco, in particular tobacco smoking, they often saw it as just simply satanic. As I said before, smoking was unknown in Europe. Smoke was associated with Satan extensively, and seeing people smoking and with clouds of smoke around them reminded them of what they thought of as satanic practices. Now, they were predisposed to do this because of their own prejudice and bigotry against indigenous peoples. We'll see later that many of the psychoactive substances used in the Americas were regarded as satanic by Spanish missionaries and officials. A very prominent author in this period, Oviedo, who wrote a very famed book on the natural history of the Indies, and by the Indies that essentially means North and South America, or at least Southern North America and South America. Widely printed and reprinted in Europe, very influential book. It had its detractors, though. A very famous Spanish cleric, Las Casas, denounced Oviedo as, quote, one of the greatest tyrants, thieves, and destroyers of the Indies, whose Historia contains almost as many lies as pages. So it's important to note who Bartolomé de las Casas was. He was a Spanish friar who had land in the Caribbean. Initially, he was quite brutal in his treatment of the indigenous peoples. Then he had a sort of a spiritual rebirth and realized what he and other Spaniards were doing to the indigenous people of the region was non-Christian and horrific. And so he devoted the rest of his career to trying to protect indigenous people from deprivations from Spanish landowners and others. He was shocked to see Spaniards smoking in Hispaniola, the island that includes Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So he wasn't exactly a proponent of smoking, but he certainly was a defender of the indigenous people. Some have suggested that he had one of the first understandings of addiction, as he wrote about the strangely compelling nature of tobacco, which is intriguing. There were other reasons why Europeans were alarmed by or frightened by tobacco. One was simply the plant itself. Tobacco is a member of a plant family called the Solanaceae. So is tomatoes or potatoes. In Europe, there was familiarity with this plant family, but most of the plants that the Europeans knew in the Solanaceae were poisonous and or deliriant drugs associated with witchcraft, such as deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake. Flowers are very similar. Anyone with any botanical knowledge could tell that there was a connection between these. And so that put not only tobacco, but for a long time, tomato and potatoes in a very suspect category. It took a couple hundred years before Europeans adopted potatoes and tomatoes, partly because of this just fear that they're part of this poisonous and some would even say a diabolical plant family. Unlike coffee and tea, tobacco was introduced to the Eastern Hemisphere first by sailors. Sailors started picking up the habit, and I should say pirates as well. My information on this comes from an article called Smoke on the Water, Tobacco, Pirates, and Seafaring in the Early Modern World. And just to quote from it, from Columbus onward, sailors and mariners had been of key importance in the dissemination of tobacco in Western culture. It was, after all, they who first came into contact with the use of tobacco by Native Americans in the New World and took up the habit, introducing it to Europe and from hence to Asia and Africa. Tobacco started its European career as an intoxicant, well, if we can call it an intoxicant, but anyway, an intoxicant for lowlifes. Upon its introduction in Europe in the 16th century, tobacco was perceived, to quote historian Marcy Norton, as a thing of slaves and tavern drinkers and people of low consideration. So at first, it comes in as a substance of low repute. That changed, though, in the mid-1500s for a variety of reasons, but a very important one was the author Nicolas Monardes, who was a noted Spanish physician and botanist, and he took a different view. He viewed tobacco as a panacea, a cure, or even a cure-all. It could be used to cure anything from a common cold to cancer, mostly in poultice form. As one follower of Monardes wrote, and again I'll quote from the text here, to seek to tell the virtues and greatness of this holy herb, the ailments which can be cured by it and have been, the evils from which it has saved thousands, would be to go on to infinity. This precious herb is so general a human need, not only for the sick, but also for the healthy. So going from a plant of very low repute associated with sailors and pirates, tobacco then moves into the pharmacopoeia, into the medicinal storehouse of physicians. And Monardes' work was widely translated. It was translated into English. And it's very interesting just to see the title that the translator chose, Joyful News Out of the Newfound World. That you have these tobacco and other plants which can evidently do marvels. Tobacco was used in European medicine for hundreds of years. This article from the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, to quote again, as the 17th century moved on, doctors increasingly mistrusted tobacco as a medicine. So after Monardes, there was a lot of trust, but people were watching and seeing the effects, and so they were losing the trust. But this did not prevent its retention in pharmacopoeias. John Wesley's Primitive Physic, first published in 1747, recommended it for earache. Blow the smoke of tobacco strongly into the ear. For falling sickness, whatever that is. For piles. And anyway, such advice continued as late as the edition of 1847. And there are certainly some people today who maintain that tobacco has great health benefits. And this is not totally made up, as the illustration here from one of these sources says that tobacco lowers risk of Parkinson's disease. Well, that may well be true. May reduce the risk of breast cancer. I'm pretty suspicious of that, and I'm pretty suspicious of most of the others. But simply because it is overall harmful and dangerous doesn't mean it can't have some medical uses. One reason why tobacco was embraced by the medical establishment for a time in the early modern period was because it fit perfectly into the prevalent humoral theory of diseases. Now, this theory goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, was picked up by Muslim physicians as well, and it was the dominant theory of disease all the way up well into the early modern period. It really didn't get supplanted until the 19th century. It was based on the idea that the human body has four essential humors, which would be blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. These are all had many different associations with being wet or dry, hot or cold, even with the seasons. And the idea of medicine, theoretical medicine, was to balance the humors in the body to restore sort of natural health. That disease came when these humors were out of balance. This is one reason why bloodletting was so common. You might have too much blood, and so you got to get rid of some of it to restore the balance. But tobacco was, not surprisingly, regarded as a very hot and dry substance. Hence, it could be useful for any phlegmatic conditions. If you were diagnosed as having an excess of phlegm, then tobacco was a useful corrective, supposedly. I should note, too, that there were opponents of the humoral disease theory for a long time. They were generally called empirics, people who just simply relied on empirical observation. But in the medical schools, that was considered as a very crude and lowly form. What you needed was this theoretical approach backed by scholars going all the way back to Galen and Hippocrates and others. Tobacco was much better known in Spain and Portugal than it was elsewhere in Europe because of Spain and Portugal's direct connections with the Americas and with tobacco smoking. A French ambassador to Portugal, Jean Nicot, in 1856, sort of excited by this idea that tobacco is a cure-all, was able to get seeds and tobacco and sent them to the King of France. And he said, you should be using and growing this plant to help fight the plague. And there were outbreaks of the bubonic plague all the way through the 17th century in Europe. After Nicot, tobacco use starts to spread among the fashionable in French society. He becomes a celebrity, and that's where we get the name nicotine and nicotiana, the name of the genus in which tobacco is found. In England, the introduction of tobacco is usually credited to Walter Raleigh, who was a privateer and naval commander, a would-be colonist, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I. So this is commonly said that he introduced it. Others said, it was Vice Admiral Sir Francis Drake. Yeah, they're all Sir. Or John Hawkins. All of these people were privateers. In other words, ship captains who were given license by the Kingdom of England to prey on Spanish shipping, as Spain was the enemy, and were quite successful at it. Sir Walter Raleigh, like I say, is usually credited. He certainly loved his tobacco. Here we have an illustration of him with a very long pipe and a servant concerned about the smoke who doesn't know what's going on, who's coming in to douse him. I have another slide showing that later on. And just to show how this connection between Walter Raleigh and tobacco has entered public imagination, I'll just briefly quote the song lyrics from the song I'm So Tired by John Lennon, the Beatles, as John saying, I'm so tired, I'm feeling so upset. Although I'm so tired, I'll have another cigarette and curse Sir Walter Raleigh. He was such a stupid get. So putting the blame on John Lennon, putting the blame on his own tobacco addiction on Sir Walter Raleigh, or Raleigh as he called him. A very interesting book on tobacco is Ian Gately's Tobacco, Cultural History. And I was rather sort of dumbfounded by this observation or discovery from Gately, and I'll quote it. The average smoker, and this is in the 16th century, late 1500s in England, the average smoker required so many accessories, including tobacco boxes, tobacco knives, tongs, and pipes, that a dedicated manservant was needed to carry them. Tobacconists, as they were were expected to possess a lengthy repertoire of tricks involving a combination of facial contortions and the expulsion of carefully shaped tobacco clouds. I looked for an illustration of Sir Walter Raleigh blowing smoke rings. I couldn't find one, but I did find one with his pipe, and you look down, you see another pipe, you see a tobacco knife, you see a few other accoutrements, and then this famous story of a servant who didn't know about tobacco, dousing him with water to put out the flames. Now, not everyone in early modern England was interested in tobacco. Like I say, there were plenty who saw people like Raleigh and Drake and Hawkins as swashbuckling heroes in the struggle against Spain, globe venturing people to emulate. And tobacco got then a very romantic association, but there were plenty who despised it, and especially King James, James the First, who follows Queen Elizabeth the First. I note here he is James the Sixth and the First. He was James the First of England. He was James the Sixth of Scotland. The two countries were not united, but under the Stuart monarchs, they shared a common king. But anyway, King James himself wrote a counterblast to tobacco, and we have a title page here where somebody has published this and then added information supposedly proving that tobacco causes scurvy, which is not exactly the case. But anyway, King James blamed Native Americans on the scourge. He said it was hateful to the nose. He was also quite ahead of the time in noting the dangers of passive smoke and dangers to the lung. He was by no means a fully modern monarch. He also endorsed witch hunting, criticized those who were skeptical of demonology, and in his book, Demonology, this book is said to have influenced Shakespeare's depiction of the weird sisters, the three witches in Macbeth. James himself, King James, could not eliminate tobacco, try as he did. So his alternative was to tax it heavily, which he hoped would reduce consumption and also contribute money to the fiscal well-being of the state. And it created a royal monopoly. So this is an idea that has been used by many people. The figure on the bottom left, very simple, raise the tobacco tax. As the tobacco tax goes up, people will quit using it because it becomes too expensive, and that will not only give revenue to the state but lower death and disease. But as the other illustration shows, there's a science behind tobacco taxation. And what is the science? Well, if you tax it too heavily, it doesn't just go away. What you get is smuggling, and that is certainly true in the United States. So the map on the bottom left shows the cigarette tax, low tax in green, high tax in red. You see New York at the highest tax. And then on the right shows percent of cigarettes consumed. Percent of smuggled cigarettes consumed as percent of total cigarettes consumed from the Tax Foundation, and it claims that over 50% of cigarettes consumed in New York have been smuggled into the state, mostly from low-tax states like North Carolina or West Virginia. There is a tremendous amount of cigarette smuggling, and it is a real problem. Globally, the very interesting website that tracks global black markets called Havoc's Scope claims that it is the 10th largest black market, $50 billion a year. It's hard to know if those are accurate numbers, but it's undoubted that tobacco smuggling from low-tax countries or subdivisions within a country to high tax subdivisions is ubiquitous, very common. I do want to have a little aside here on the historical tobacco monopoly in the Philippines. It's something that I've done a little bit of research on myself. So many countries have established tobacco monopolies. China has one today. It was very transformative in the Spanish colony of the Philippines. Spanish colonial authorities had a hard time finding the necessary revenue to run their colony, so they established a tobacco monopoly. Tobacco had spread very rapidly in the 1500s and 1600s. And what it resulted in, well, it did bring in some revenue, but it also resulted in massive smuggling from ethnic groups that were not under Spanish control. And then that led to military assaults on those people. So the people in particular I'm talking about have sometimes been sometimes collectively called the Igorots. There's actually about 7 or 8 ethnic groups there. They live in the highlands of northern Luzon. You can see on the map Luzon is the main island of the Philippines. Manila is located there, but in the north there's a pretty rugged mountain range, and the Spaniards were never able to control it. They tried for a few hundred years. The end in the late 1800s, they were finally getting a hold on it, but it became a massive area for tobacco growing and smuggling. The Igorot people today, and I should say that illustration is not accurate. It shows traditional attire, which people are never going to wear, maybe at a certain festive occasions. But they number some almost 2 million, so it's a substantial population. And there's a tremendous irony here. Usually, they're usually regarded as tribal peoples. Many of them have never converted to Christianity. Some have, but many haven't. They really were never Hispanicized like other peoples of the Philippines were. But today it's one of the richer parts of the Philippines, at least in per capita gross domestic product. This is a map I made a few years ago. It's a bit out of date, but the basic patterns still hold. And you can see Manila having by far the highest per capita GDP, the Muslim area of the Philippines in the south with the lowest. But you can see the Cordillera, this mountain range with the Igorot, so-called tribal people, is in the second highest category. And I suspect this partly has to do with the heritage of commercialized economies, which goes back to the tobacco monopoly when they were eagerly engaged in commercial, albeit illicit activities, at least illicit by the Spanish authorities. Back to Europe. Tobacco spreads in Central Europe in the 17th century, particularly during the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, an absolutely devastating war. The map shows the percentage population lost in the Holy Roman Empire during this 30 years of bloodshed. Most people died not from battles, but rather from diseases that spread from the armies, or even starvation as armies stripped out all their food. But war is associated with an awful lot of boredom. One of the things that helps relieve boredom is smoking. So no surprise, military encampments are often associated with drug use from alcohol. Or I talked about coffee in the Civil War in the United States, but tobacco is right in this category of spreading in times of war often. Well, as tobacco spreads, there becomes a problem of supply. So tobacco is being imported from the Spanish colonies in the Americas, but it wasn't really adequate, or at least there was a lot of demand. Demand was growing, and a new supply starts coming in even before the 30 Years' War, but intensifying afterwards. Anyway, a new supply from English North America, from the Virginia colony in particular. And the Virginia colony at first was having a very difficult time surviving for a variety of reasons. Partly it was sort of health reasons. It wasn't a particularly healthy environment. But there was a problem in getting an economic basis for that colony. And the basis that did come in was tobacco growing. And the usual story, and there's a lot of evidence for this, if you want to get to the origin, it was the indigenous princess, if you will, Pocahontas, who married John Rolfe, English colonist. She was quite familiar with tobacco cultivation because her people had been growing and using tobacco for millennia, essentially, if you will. And anyway, she taught him how to grow tobacco. There was a problem, though. The tobacco that she was familiar with was Tabacum rustica, this very potent variety with other alkaloids in it. So something else needed to be done. If you read this road sign carefully, I'm not going to read it, but you can go back and read it. He was able to obtain seeds from Nicotiana tabacum, the common tobacco plant, which is doesn't have those other alkaloids and doesn't have as much nicotine, and it's actually much milder and easier to consume. So the combination of getting those new plants and with her knowledge, tobacco becomes the main cash crop of the Virginia colony, and there's just explosive growth. We have pretty good numbers on this. So 1611, the first crop. By 1618, 20,000 pounds. 1619, enslaved Africans are brought in because there's a labor shortage. Tobacco growing requires quite a bit of labor. And then 4 years later, 60,000. By 1630, 1,500,000 pounds. So that was the basic lifeblood of the Virginia colony. Tobacco was used as currency. It was really what kept that colony afloat. Eventually, there are problems with soil exhaustion and other problems. Tobacco moves. This map shows tobacco production about a decade before the Civil War, and you could see in Virginia and in Maryland a lot of tobacco. That was the original core, but then moving into Kentucky and Tennessee, even into Missouri. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any maps showing tobacco production during the colonial period. But it's not just the Americas. Tobacco cultivation spreads rapidly. First tobacco consumption spreads, and then eventually tobacco cultivation spreads as well. Tobacco can grow in a variety of different climates. It needs a fairly long growing season. You're not going to grow it really in Arctic areas or the like, but even Sweden is able to grow tobacco. And this just shows a map of current tobacco production, so we could see a couple areas in North Carolina and Kentucky in particular, quite a bit in southern Brazil. In southern Africa, Zimbabwe, you can practically trace its outline on the map there. In India, and you see a big green area in China. China is the largest producer of tobacco these days. But anyway, back to the history. Genoese and Venetian merchants who were trading with the Middle East took tobacco there very quickly, and it started to spread. The Portuguese have outposts in Asia, so they're taking it to China and India and Japan, where it spreads as well. And it even spreads in Africa. At this time, the Europeans only had little isolated coastal enclaves. Africa had such a virulent disease environment that Europeans had a life expectancy of about a year if they stayed on the African mainland. But tobacco spread from these little coastal enclaves inland very quickly. Some suggest it spread especially rapidly because smoking was already known, that people in parts of Africa were smoking cannabis. That's uncertain. Anyway, there were many efforts to forbid tobacco. It was seen even more than coffee as a dangerous innovation, especially with smoking, a rather bizarre practice. Concerns were raised about its possible health effects, about its odor, sort of many other problems. And in a variety of states, there were laws all the way up to capital punishment. So Russia in the early 1600s was officially a capital offense. Smokers sometimes had their lips split or were castrated or exiled. In the Ottoman Empire under Murad IV, we saw him in the lecture on coffee, where he supposedly would wander around at night and cut the heads off of coffee drinkers. I'm skeptical about that, but he certainly was opposed to and outlawed coffee and tobacco. Some sources say up to 25,000 smokers executed. I wonder. Tokugawa Japan banned it in 1609 and then felt they had to do it again in 1612, 1615, 1616. And they weren't killing people, but they were confiscating property. Ming China in 1640 declared the death penalty for it, but none of these methods were able to expunge tobacco. It was too tempting, especially for those who were addicted. The Dutch, who built a global maritime venture with many imperial aspects, used tobacco extensively in their empire building projects. It's not a very good map. Like I say, it's exaggerated and anachronistic. In other words, it takes areas that were under Dutch rule at different times and puts them together. And they never ruled many of those areas. They just had little coastal enclaves. Their core was in the what was then called the East Indies or Indonesia, although they also had a lot of operations in the West Indies. And there are still places in the West Indies like Aruba, Curacao that are officially part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. But anyway, there's a quote from Jan van Riebeck, who was in the Dutch West India Company, who claimed if we had no tobacco, there would hardly be any trade. So they were trading tobacco extensively in what is now Indonesia. There's a lot of evidence that they would give out tobacco to people, get them addicted, and then they would become good customers for the tobacco that they would bring in initially from the Western Hemisphere. Forms of tobacco consumption changed. There were different sort of historical periods where in different places different ways of ingesting tobacco were favored. Among European elites in the 18th century, it was snorting snuff. Snuff is dried ground tobacco, ground quite finely, sniffed up the nose, much like cocaine powder is sniffed. In reading Gately's book, I was very surprised in this description of snuff, and I'll just read it out. Snuff was inhaled to be expelled, not retained, and to provoke a sneeze. Much emphasis was laid on not grimacing while snorting. A polished snuff taker also required a steady hand, smooth nostrils, and a clean-shaven face. Careless snuffers were a mess. So evidently they would sniff or snort so much powdered tobacco, that it would impel the body to sneeze, and there would have been, of course, a lot of snot associated with that if one wasn't careful. So it was a bit of a challenge, but as you can see from the illustration, gentlemen and ladies, many of them took to snuff in a big way. Snuff boxes, the paraphernalia associated with it, were often very elaborate, highly decorated. Today they're avidly collected. Some of them are quite beautiful. We'll see later on a very similar thing with betel nut in Southeast Asia, where betel boxes were quite similar and are avidly collected to this day. Snuff snorting changed in the early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s. And historians link it to one person in particular, Beau Brummel. Beau Brummel was a dandy. He was a very close friend of the Prince of Wales, who later becomes King George IV. So he was part of this very aristocratic milieu. You could see educated at Eton and then Oriel College in Oxford. And Brummel was, like I say, a dandy, very, very concerned about dress and comportment and manners. He is sometimes associated with what has been known as the great male renunciation. And by renunciation, scholars mean renunciation of colorful and highly elaborate clothes. So I have an illustration here showing Brummel and a figure from the pre-Brummel period, where wealthy men previously dressed in very colorful, very, very elaborate clothes. And Brummel's idea of sartorial sophistication was to tone everything down. Men should only be wearing neutral colors, grays, whites, navy, black. They should emphasize well-tailored, close-fitting clothes, but not over elaboration or ornamentation. And that set the style. And as historians of dress will say, it's never been quite the same, although there are elements of society today that are certainly bringing back elaborate and colorful dress for men. But for most of the post-Brummel history, that really didn't quite disappeared, but diminished. I find it interesting that Beau Brummel and his snuff habit are evidently still culturally relevant. I was surprised to find a national best-selling series, the Beau Brummel Mysteries, and here's one called The Tainted Snuff Box. I think it's worth just reading from the back of it. Hired by the prince as his personal food taster, the odious baronet is a poor substitute for the polite company of London society that Beau was used to. Some refinement appears in the form of a new blend of snuff prepared by Beau's good friend Petersham. So it just shows you sort of the continuing relevance of this very interesting figure. The Romantic period, though, follows closely, and everything changes. The Romantic period is usually associated in Britain anyway from the first half of the 19th century, especially after the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815. But there's a real sharp decline in snuff. It almost disappears in pipes, and especially cigars come in. The Romantics wanted a sort of a more natural, non-affected way of dress and comportment. Out went the powdered wigs, almost completely gone. The Romantic period is associated with many poets and other writers, no one more than Lord Byron, who was a sort of a rock star of the era. And just to quote from, I give a quote from Byron from one of his poems, sublime tobacco, which from east to west cheers the tar's labor or the Turkman's rest, which on the Moslem Ottoman divides his hours and rivals opium in his bride, magnificent in Stamboul, but less grand, though not less loved, in Wapping and the Strand, divine in hookahs, glorious in a pipe, when tipped with amber, mellow, rich, and ripe, like other charmers wooing the caress, more dazzling when daring in full dress, yet thy true lovers more admire by far the naked beauties. Give me a cigar. So the cigar was the naked form of tobacco wrapped in tobacco leaves. And yes, all these other forms of smoking are wonderful, but cigars are the best. And there are Byron labeled cigar brands to this day. Now, with the rise of decline of snuff and the rise of smoking, there is the problem of tobacco odor, and cigars were not something that women were smoking. This was a male form of consumption. So as cigars and pipes spread among men of Europe, tobacco consumption for women goes way down, but does not for men. But there is this problem. These are especially in elite families. How do you mitigate tobacco odor? So we get the smoking room in the houses of the elite, of the gentry and the aristocracy and the wealthier merchants. We get smoking jackets and other smoking clothes. So you have special places and special dress for this. Things are different in the United States. In the U.S. in the 1800s, it's chewing tobacco that's dominant. It was found in Europe, but it was really the United States where this became the main, especially the first half of the 1800s. European visitors were often disgusted. I have as illustrations a chewing tobacco advertisement and then a spittoon, because with chewing tobacco you put a wad of tobacco leaf between your cheek and gum, and sort of just, you don't really chew on it, you just sort of suck on it, but you get copious saliva, which is going to be spat out. And Charles Dickens had a tour of the United States, and he was disgusted. So to quote him, as Washington may be called the headquarters of tobacco tinctured saliva, the time has come when I must confess that the prevalence of these two odious practices of chewing and expectorating begin to be anything but agreeable and soon become most offensive and sickening. In all the public places of America, this filthy habit is recognized. So it made a bit of a difference between European, especially polite European society, and the more rough and tumble ways of the United States. Well, things changed dramatically in the U.S. In the second half of the 19th century. And what happens is what is sometimes called the bright leaf revolution, which was a new form of tobacco. Not only a new way of sort of cultivating it and, more important, curing it, but a new delivery system. And the new delivery system is the cigarette. But the bright leaf revolution starts in the Piedmont of North Carolina in particular, and into Virginia, an area noted for its relatively poor sandy soils. And these soils would produce weak tobacco plants, but they had sweeter leaves, literally more sugar content. More important, a new method of curing was discovered by an enslaved worker. We only know his name, Stephen, and we know the date, though, 1839. And this was using charcoal to dry and cure, and charcoal burns without smoke. And the combination of these sweet leaves from these weaker plants and this curing technique produced bright leaf tobacco. I'm going to end this lecture now, and we will move into the bright leaf revolution in part 2. But it was bright leaf that led to cigarettes, which actually greatly increased the harm of tobacco. Smoking pipes, smoking cigars, chewing tobacco, all those have some health problems, to be sure. But the real problem of lung cancer, that comes with a cigarette, and that comes after the bright leaf revolution. So I will soon record and tape the second half of this lecture. Thank you very much.